Hi there, and welcome to Ku English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. Herbert Alexander Simon. Where a Mind Was Formed, Part 1. Chapter 1. A Household Filled with Questions. Herbert Alexander Simon was born on June 15, 1916, in the American city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. At the time, Milwaukee was a place where many immigrants had settled, bringing their languages, customs, and ambitions. Factories hummed along the rivers, breweries filled the air with the smell of grain, and neighborhoods formed around churches, schools, and small businesses. It was a practical city, shaped by labor and engineering rather than aristocratic traditions. Simon's family belonged to this world of educated immigrants who valued knowledge and hard work. His father, Arthur Simon, had come from Germany. Arthur was trained as an electrical engineer, but he also had an artistic side. He designed patents and inventions, and he sometimes wrote poetry. He could speak with equal interest about machinery and literature. At home, books were everywhere, on shelves, tables, and sometimes stacked on the floor. His mother, Edna Merkel Simon, was a talented pianist. Music filled the household. She had once dreamed of becoming a professional musician, but life had taken a different path. Still, she practiced regularly, and Herbert grew up hearing Beethoven and Chopin floating through the rooms of their modest home. The Simons were not wealthy, but they belonged to a class that believed deeply in education. Conversations at dinner could shift from politics to science, from philosophy to current events. Herbert grew up hearing adults debate ideas rather than simply accept them. This atmosphere mattered. Many children grow up surrounded by instructions, what to do, what not to do, what is right or wrong. Herbert grew up surrounded by questions. Why does a machine work this way? Why do governments make certain decisions? Why do people sometimes behave irrationally? No one yet knew that these questions would one day shape entire fields of research. When Herbert was still young, the world outside the house was changing rapidly. The First World War had ended only a few years earlier. New technologies, cars, radios, telephones, were transforming everyday life. America was becoming a modern society full of organizations, factories, and bureaucracies that managed large systems. But young Herbert did not think in such grand terms. He was simply a curious child. He liked puzzles, he liked systems, and he liked the feeling that behind every complicated problem, there might be a structure waiting to be understood. Teachers soon noticed something unusual about him. Herbert was not the loudest student in class, nor the most socially confident. In fact, he could be quiet and reserved. But when a difficult question appeared, especially one that required careful reasoning, his mind seemed to wake up. He studied the structure of the problem first. This habit would remain with him throughout his life. Yet childhood was not only filled with intellectual curiosity. Like many thoughtful children, Herbert sometimes felt a sense of distance from others. While some classmates were focused on sports or social games, Herbert often preferred reading or thinking quietly. He did not always feel that he belonged fully in the noisy world of childhood competition. Books became companions. One afternoon, while browsing through books at home, Herbert discovered something that fascinated him deeply: the idea that human decisions could be studied scientifically. The idea was strange and exciting. Most people believed that decisions were guided by intuition, emotion, or tradition. But could they be analyzed logically? Could the mind itself be understood like a system? At the time, Herbert had no idea that these questions would one day lead him to win one of the world's most prestigious prizes. For now, he was simply a boy in Milwaukee, surrounded by books, music, and questions that seemed too large for childhood. But seeds had already been planted. Chapter 2. Discovering the Power of Ideas. As Herbert Simon grew older, his curiosity deepened rather than fading. Some children lose interest in questions once school turns them into routine exercises. Herbert experienced the opposite. Each new subject seemed like a doorway into another puzzle. Mathematics attracted him because it offered clarity. In a world full of confusion, numbers followed rules. Logic could reveal structures hidden beneath complicated situations. But mathematics was not the only subject that captured his imagination. Politics also intrigued him. Milwaukee had a strong tradition of political debate. In fact, the city was known for its unusual history of sewer socialism, a practical form of socialism focused on improving public infrastructure and city services. Political arguments were common in newspapers, public meetings, and conversations among neighbors. Young Herbert listened carefully. He began to wonder, why do governments make the decisions they make? Why are some policies efficient while others fail? Why do organizations often behave in ways that seem irrational? These were not typical questions for a teenager, yet they occupied his mind. During his high school years, Herbert discovered books that examined society in systematic ways. He read works about economics, political science, and public administration. Some of these books were difficult, but Herbert enjoyed the challenge. He felt that he was slowly discovering a hidden layer beneath everyday life. Many people saw organizations, governments, companies, institutions as mysterious or chaotic. Herbert began to suspect that they might follow patterns that could be studied. Still, he remained uncertain about his future. He did not dream of fame or recognition. What he wanted was something simpler, the chance to keep exploring questions that fascinated him. In 1933, he entered the University of Chicago. The university was famous for intense intellectual debate. Professors challenged students to question assumptions and examine evidence carefully. Ideas were not treated as sacred. They were tested through argument. For Herbert, this environment felt both thrilling and intimidating. He was surrounded by brilliant students, many of whom seemed confident and outspoken. Herbert, by contrast, often felt shy. He preferred careful reflection to rapid debate, yet he slowly found his place. Instead of trying to imitate others, he focused on the questions that truly interested him: decision-making, organizations, and rationality. One particular influence came from reading about the philosopher and economist Vilfredo Pareto. Pareto had argued that human actions were often less rational than people believed. This idea fascinated Herbert. If people were not perfectly rational, how did decisions actually happen? What limits shaped human thinking? These questions would later become central to Simon's work, but during his university years, they existed only as faint outlines of ideas that had not yet fully formed. He was still searching, still exploring, still trying to understand the mysterious machinery of the human mind. Chapter 3. The first glimpse of a lifelong question. During Herbert Simon's final years at the University of Chicago, an important realization began to take shape. It did not arrive suddenly like a flash of inspiration. Instead, it emerged gradually, like a pattern slowly becoming visible through fog. Simon had been studying political science and public administration. These fields attempted to understand how governments and organizations operated. Yet he noticed something strange in the theories he was reading. Many of them assumed that decision-makers were perfectly rational. In these models, administrators carefully examined every possible option and always chose the best one. But Simon suspected that real life was different. He had observed people closely: professors, students, administrators. He had watched discussions, meetings, and debates. Again and again, he noticed something curious. People rarely possessed complete information. They often made choices under uncertainty, time pressure, or confusion. Their decisions were not perfect calculations. They were approximations. This realization stayed with him. At the time, Simon was working on research related to municipal administration, how city governments organized their work and made policy decisions. He interviewed officials, examined documents, and tried to understand how real decisions occurred inside institutions. The gap between theory and reality became impossible to ignore. Traditional theory described decision-makers as if they were flawless calculating machines. Reality showed something much more human. People used shortcuts. They relied on limited information. They stopped searching once they found an acceptable solution. Simon did not yet have a name for this idea, but the seed of what he would later call bounded rationality had already been planted. At the same time, Simon was facing personal uncertainty about his career. The academic world could be unpredictable. and he wondered whether his unusual interests would find a place there. Friends sometimes encouraged him to pursue more traditional paths. Political science already had established topics and methods. Simon's questions about decision processes and human reasoning seemed unconventional, yet he felt a quiet conviction that these questions mattered. Somewhere inside the complex structures of organizations, he believed there must be patterns governing how decisions were made. If those patterns could be understood, perhaps society itself could be organized more intelligently. By the late 1930s, Simon had completed his undergraduate studies and was preparing for the next stage of his intellectual journey. He was still young, his ideas were still forming, the world had not yet recognized his name. But a lifelong investigation had already begun, the attempt to understand how human beings think, decide, and solve problems within the limits of their own minds. The questions that began in a quiet Milwaukee household were about to lead him into a much larger world of research, debate, and discovery. And in that world, Herbert Simon would eventually change the way scientists understand the human mind itself. The awakening had only just begun. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.